Welcome to this contextual introduction to Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. A passage in the Torah, which is the Jewish holy book that Christians think of as the Old Testament, forbids the charging of interest when Hebrews give loans to other Hebrews. And in the medieval Christian world, charging interest was considered greedy and sinful. So to an agrarian culture, the idea is wealth comes from the crops that you grow, or the animals that you breed, or the fish that you gather, or that your slaves do that work for you. But the idea is you're working the land that you inherited from your ancestors. And it seemed like cheating to them to make money by charging interest. You're not doing the work yourself. You're not taking the risk yourself. You're just letting somebody else use your money. Now, in a merchant society, having ready cash at hand so that you can do a deal is vital. It's important. It's good business. So the wealthy Christians would tolerate the Jews among them because the Jews were the ones that were permitted to do this charging interest on loans, which was thought of in the medieval world as the sin of usury. Now, so when I say wealthy Christians tolerated Jews, well, they did sometimes in some cities until they needed a scapegoat, at which point the Jews were a convenient target, and that has happened for centuries. And it's still an ongoing problem in the world today. And sometimes the justification for violence against Jews, Christians would use the biblical story of Jesus turning over tables and using whips to chase money changers out of the temple. So now the title character in The Merchant of Venice is not a Jewish merchant. The Merchant of Venice the title character is Antonio, a wealthy merchant who he starts off the play wondering why he's sad, and he can't quite figure out why. His friends Solarino and Solanio, those names are so hard for me to figure out which is which. They're kind of interchangeable followers of Antonio. They say, well, if I had as much wealth tied up in sea voyages right now, I'd be sad too. And Antonio says, no, that's not it. I've set out different ships in different directions. All my wealth is not tied up to any one particular business venture. So he's feeling pretty confident. He's not sad because he's worried about his money. And Solanio suggests maybe Antonio is in love. And Antonio says, fie. That's all he says. Does he say it jokingly? Does he say it dismissively? There's a lot of room for how actors can work with that. But at any rate, these two supporters of Antonio, they kind of serve their purpose by having him talk about the exposition. You kind of know this is a merchant and you know what's going on with his life. They leave when people that they call better people arrive, better company arrive. Among the better company that's arriving is Bassanio, who we understand is a kinsman of Antonio. We don't know how close. He's got a high social rank, but not a lot of money. With Bassanio are Graziano and Lorenzo, who we shall see from events later on in the play are not themselves as high-ranking as Bassanio, but they're young nobles in Bassanio's his squad of bachelors. And by the way, since this is a comedy, the audience, upon seeing these three bachelors, would expect they're going to expect some weddings to happen by the end of the play. Now, after teasing Antonio for his sadness, Graziano tells Lorenzo it's time to go. And these two, they've kind of been part of the train that accompanied Bassanio to Antonio, and then Graziano tells Lorenzo, let's go. And that kind of establishes the pecking order with Antonio on top, because these guys are coming, they leave Bassanio to do business and go off together. The business that Bassanio wants is he wants a loan. Bassanio admits he's not very good at business. He's lost money before, and he says, give me a little bit more money. And although Bassanio admits he's failed in business before, he says he's got a new option right now. And his new option is a wealthy lady called Portia is attracting suitors from around the world. And Bassanio is asking for money from Antonio so that he can finance a trip to Belmont, which is the provincial town somewhere outside of Venice. We don't know exactly where Portia lives. And Antonio agrees. Scene 2 introduces to this lady, Portia, in her town of Belmont. We don't really know where Belmont is. It doesn't really seem to be a real place, but the point is, it's not the sort of cutthroat, business-controlled, testosterone-driven culture of Venice. It's someplace else. And in this other place else, we have Portia is grumbling and complaining to her waiting woman, Nerissa. At some time previously, Portia's father died and left some strings on her inheritance. And Portia's grumbling about this. She says, thus is the will of a living daughter curbed by the will of a dead father. Punning on will as in free will and will as in the legal document of inheritance. Now, while Portia already knows all about the terms of this will, the audience does not. And it's a little awkward, but Nerissa here explains the whole thing for our benefit. What's happening is Portia's father has set things up so that there's they call it a cask, but it's like a chest made of gold, silver, and lead, 3 of them. And the suitors are supposed to pick one of these casks, and if they pick the right one according to what Portia's father decided, then they get to win Portia's hand. And Portia's grumbling because she has no choice in the matter. And Nerissa kind of optimistically says, well, your father is a good man, and certainly whoever picks the right cask will be a good person worthy of your love. And Nerissa's not so sure about that. In a kind of a comic scene, Nerissa grumbles about all the other suitors who've been bothering her, and one of these potential suitors is the young Baron of England. Now they're in Venice now, so these supposed Venetians have a little fun. Shakespeare's having fun at himself. These Venetian characters are poking fun at the young Baron of England, who can't speak any foreign languages, but only English, and so they can't communicate with each other very well. And he borrows fashion from all over Europe. He can't. This English suitor comes dressed like everybody in Europe, but can't talk to them. So Shakespeare's kind of poking fun at his own culture. Now, and just in case the audience hasn't figured it out yet, Nerissa asks Portia, she remembers this particular young man who isn't among the suitors that are chasing her right now, but remember there's this one particular young man, and Portia says, oh yeah, Bassanio. Then she goes, I think that's his name. And the idea is Portia has his name right at her fingertips. So Portia knows of Bassanio just as Bassanio knows of Portia. And so in the first 2 scenes, Shakespeare has set up the main love interest. Now, scene 3 introduces some plot complications here, and this is where we are introduced to the most famous character of the Merchant of Venice, and that is Shylock, the Jewish merchant. Bassanio is closing a loan deal with Shylock. Antonio has said to Bassanio, go get a loan, I will be your guarantor for the loan. So the idea is, if Antonio can't pay Shylock back, he pays a penalty. If he does pay Shylock back, then according to the idea that interest on a loan is bad, if you give all the money back, you shouldn't be charged any interest. Anyway, that's the deal that they work out, even though Shylock is not very happy with it and kind of grumbles a little about it. But before they're setting out these details, they quibble. Shylock and Bassanio are talking, and they quibble over what it means when Shylock says Antonio is a good man. Bassanio is kind of naive, and he has maybe a traditional understanding of what it means to be good, and Shylock points out, no, he means good for business. He's sufficient to guarantee the loan. So we have a little difference of opinion here, where Shakespeare is pointing out Bassanio sees the goodness in the man, Shylock sees a business opportunity. Now, when Antonio enters, Shylock has an aside. Now, the convention in Shakespearean drama, Elizabethan drama, the time period is, at a time period where they couldn't bring all the lights down and put a spotlight on the main character and zoom in, or they couldn't have a voiceover narration. What happens is a character will speak to the audience as an aside, and the convention is that nobody on stage hears what this character is saying. What we're doing is we're hearing the character's internal thoughts. And Shylock's internal thoughts are, he gives that his first reason for hating Antonio is that Antonio is a Christian. But he goes on to say that it's really, or maybe in addition, maybe we could say it's really, because Antonio lends money to his friends for free, which robs Shylock of the opportunity to make money by charging interest on loans. Now, Shylock notes that in the Bible, when Jacob worked for his uncle Laban, Laban said that Jacob could keep all the livestock that were born with stripes. And in Shylock's version of the story, Shylock credits Jacob for artificially increasing the number of striped livestock by, according to the biblical story, exposing the animals to striped sticks, which in the logic of the biblical story and the way Shylock is telling the story, exposing an animal to striped sticks makes the animal have striped offspring. And Shylock sees that this is something clever that Jacob did that increased his wealth. And Shylock was saying, I'm clever, I should be able to get an increase in my wealth too, just like Shylock did. Antonio interprets this biblical story a little bit differently. Antonio says, well, the reason why there were more animals that were born with stripes was because God blessed Jacob and wanted him to have those animals. Now, Antonio is dismissing the role that Jacob's personal cleverness played in his increasing wealth. And now I think you and I would expect that exposing animals to sticks doesn't affect the genetics of their offspring. But Shakespeare's audience might well have thought that Shylock's interpretation was perfectly reasonable, or at least they wouldn't have rejected it out of hand based on we would reject it out of hand based on what we know about, animal biology. But Shakespeare's audience also would probably be predisposed to believe Antonio's interpretation of Scripture simply because Antonio is a Christian and he is the title character of the play, The Merchant of Venice. We also see Antonio is nice enough to help his young friend get some money to go try and get the girl. So we're predisposed to believe Antonio and trust Antonio and dislike Shylock. We also see that Antonio is involved in this business because he wants to help Bassanio, but Shylock is involved in this business not because he cares about a love affair, because he likes the idea of having Antonio in his power. Because remember, Shylock is not going to make any money if Antonio pays back the loan on time. What Shylock would want is for Antonio to default on the loan, and then he can charge a fine, and that's how he would make money. Shylock notes that Antonio frequently insults him in public, calling him a dog. And Shylock points out, well, does a dog have money? You might call me a dog, but because I have money, you come to me anyway. And this kind of ticks Antonio off, and he kind of takes the bait and starts getting angry. And right when he's riled Antonio up, Shylock says, no, tell you what, remember, I'm offering this loan at no interest. Or maybe here's when he proposes it for the first time. And Antonio is so confident that he will be able to pay this loan back that he agrees to what Shylock calls a merry sport. And this idea that Shylock gives is, since Antonio is 100% positive he'll be able to pay back the loan and won't have to pay a fine, Shylock says, well, in this merry sport, why don't we make the fine be, I get to cut a pound of flesh off your body, wherever I want to. And Antonio arrogantly says, sure, that's never going to happen. I've got enough wealth that I'll be able to pay you back. I just don't have the money on me right now. But by the time the loan is due, I will have that money for you. Okay, so now structurally in this play, Shylock was created to serve as the villain in a comedy that was performed for a society where Jews had been banned for generations. It is very likely that it's unlikely that anybody in Shakespeare's audience would ever even have seen a real Jew, or if they did, perhaps they saw it in another city outside of England when they were traveling. Because these Jewish characters were absent from the culture, and the stereotypes about them being greedy and miserly and overly legalistic persisted in Shakespeare's culture, having a Jewish character would have been, if you needed a villain for your play, a Jewish villain would be a stock character, because nobody would need a motivation to believe that this Jewish character was bad. It's just, the stereotype at the time was to expect that Jewish characters, Jewish people, were greedy. And that would have been motivation enough. I'm not saying that's right, but I'm saying that was a culturally prevalent bias in the mainstream majority culture at the time. Now, when we keep in mind that Shakespeare was a product of his time, he was a product of the prejudices and the beliefs, the virtues, but also the vices of his time period. It is amazing that, given that Shakespeare grew up in an environment where Jews were vilified, and given that Shakespeare needed an evil character, he needed a villain for this story, it's surprising to see that Shakespeare gave Shylock some really good speeches that humanize him. We sympathize with him. We understand that he has a depth and an interior life that goes beyond twirling a mustache and cackling and being greedy. There's actually a scene in Act 4 that shows just how far the Christian society is willing to go in order to save this Antonio, who, rather arrogantly agreed to a really stupid deal. Just how far the Christian society is willing to go to save Antonio and punish Shylock. The most common reading of critics today is that we can see Shylock as a tragic victim, even though structurally in the play he's a comic villain. Shakespeare gave him enough of an interior life that a modern production, a modern actor, can make the audience identify with Shylock in a way that perhaps Shakespeare's audience wouldn't have intended. Now, in this society of Venice, as Shakespeare imagines it, if Jews and Christians think of their faith first, they're at each other's throats. And if they can put aside their differences in faith, well, they can mutually benefit in the world of business. Now, it might be too much to say that this play presents like an optimistic view of, emerging capitalism where people with different cultures work side by side. I think that's a little bit too optimistic. But this play does also blame Antonio's arrogance. Pride goeth before the fall. Antonio pridefully signs a really dumb contract, and he's confident his wealth will shield him from any repercussions that come from his habit of calling Jews dogs and yet expecting them to do business with him at no profit to themselves. This play doesn't present Antonio simply as the hapless victim of a motiveless villain. In a similar way, it doesn't present the villain Shylock as an evil, mustache-twirling, one-dimensional character. The hero has weaknesses, the villain has, if not exactly virtues, we empathize with him at a level that it probably wasn't strictly necessary in order to get the comedy taken care of. And this imperfect portrayal of the Christian enemy to Shylock highlights how Shylock's values are actually similar to Antonio's. Each is willing to tolerate the other if that toleration is a way to profit. So the criticism that Shakespeare is allowing us to see in Shylock's greediness, he's also tarring the Christian characters with the same brush. And it's notable seeing how Shakespeare did that. And the play is raising all these issues about Shylock's humanity and the humanity of Jews. It's in a subplot. The subplots in Shakespeare, well, this is an unusually heavy subplot for a lighthearted, comic, romantic caper. There's mistaken identities. There's cross-dressing that happens in Act 4, and that comic overtone kind of seems to work against how seriously Shakespeare's brilliant language and understanding of humanity invites us to take this character, Shylock. Now, we've met all the main characters now, except early in Act 2, we meet the clown Lancelot Gobbo, who is Shylock's servant. In that scene, Lancelot talks about, he talks himself into running away from Shylock. He doesn't want to be a servant to Shylock anymore. Lancelot runs into his own father, who's called Gobbo. So we have Lancelot, Gobbo is the servant. His father is listed in the script as Gobbo. We also, early in Act 2, we meet Shylock's daughter, Jessica, who has a secret relationship with somebody we've already met in this play yet. I don't want to give too much away. So Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice is one of the plays that critics call a problem play. The question of what to do with Shylock is kind of complex, and the Shylock subplot, the question of does Bassanio get Portia's hand is actually resolved in Act 3. Act 4 resolves the conflict between Shylock and Antonio, and Act 5 is kind of a sitcom that deals with mistaken identities and husbands and wives learning to trust each other. It's an unusual structure, given that Shylock is the kind of the most famous character of this play. His absence in Act 5 is a little bit unusual, but I don't want to give too much of that plot away. But so I hope this introduction to the ideas behind Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice will help you get into the play and understand it as one of Shakespeare's risky, complex works that when we look at it 400 years later with the wisdom that comes from 400 years of understanding the value of diversity, we still recognize the prejudices that were part of the structure of this play, but I do think it is a testament to Shakespeare's brilliance and his keen ability to observe human nature that he provided Shylock with enough of an interior life that the Shylock character, though he functions in this play as a comic villain, can also be read as a tragic victim in a plot that questions some of the values of the dominant culture. And with that, I'm going to say happy reading, and I hope you enjoy what you've learned about Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice.